Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the final day of March Meeting 2021, Unraveling the Present. I am Noor Al-Mualla, Director of Learning and Research at Sharjah Art Foundation. I'm happy to present our final 4 presentations of March Meeting 2021 papers. March Meeting papers are a series of essays selected from an open call announced in 2019, inviting artists, writers, and thinkers to expand on Okwui Enwezor's influential thinking about biennials as platforms to engage with history, politics, and society. The series revealed the extent to which biennials have contributed to the realization of new narratives and experiences of modern and contemporary art. All papers are now accessible in a digital format in the March Meeting open call section on our website, sharjahart.org. Our next presenter is Silke Schmickl. She's a curator whose work engages with the contemporary art scenes in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Presently working at M+, she was previously a curator at the National Gallery in Singapore, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Singapore, a researcher at the German Art History Center in Paris, and the co-founding director of Loewe, a Paris-based curatorial platform and publishing house for artists' moving images between 2001 and 2016. She has curated exhibitions in partnership with museums and biennials in Singapore, Paris, Guangzhou, Beirut, and Düsseldorf. Schmickl studied art history, French literature, and intercultural communications at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich and Sorbonne Paris University, where she graduated with a master's in art history on Thomas Ruth's museum's photographs. We will be taking questions from the audience in the final 5 minutes. Simultaneous translation to Arabic is available in the chat box. I would now like to invite Silke to present her paper.
Thank you so much, Nora, for this kind introduction, and also to the Sharjah Art Foundation for this opportunity to present actually some ideas of my article, which in its full title is titled Redefining the Art Institution's Role in Society Through Democratic, Art-Centric, and Digital Approaches, a Singapore case study. Let me share my screen. So as Nora just said, this article responded to the Foundation's open call, and I have chosen one of the suggested subtopics, which was the changing relationship between art and civic imagination. And I focus mainly on Singapore because that's the place where I lived for many years and worked as a curator at the National Gallery until just very recently before joining M+ in Hong Kong. So my presentation is really informed by my personal experience of being a curator who worked for a very long time independently with Loewe in Paris and then now institutionally. And I think this shift from a very independent activity into the institutional context gave me some insights and maybe some reflections that sit somewhere in between. So indeed, when I left my position as Loewe's co-founding director in Paris in 2015 to move to Singapore, my work experience in the same field dramatically changed. This was not only because of the different working culture that is inherent in the geographical landscape of a country, neither the shift from a small independent organization into a large national organization. It was really also the role of the museum in society itself that I felt was undergoing major changes. And I will share with you today some observations of these changes that I made in Singapore, and will conclude with 2 ideas that, in my opinion, are interesting for institutions to consider. On the one hand, the necessity to take a stronger democratic and art-centric approach. And secondly, the importance to make the digital a really integral part of curatorial activity. So I have been involved in Southeast Asian and especially Singapore projects since the mid-2000s, and I developed a particular attachment to Singapore in those years. The country's rising and community-driven art scene stood in stark contrast with Paris' established art institutions and offered multiple opportunities for me to engage with local artists and institutions. My interest in time-based media found resonance there, as well as my interest in artists' creative strategies in fairly state-controlled environments. And this investigational research and also my interest in artists' examinations of critical contemporary subjects were also at the core of Low Wave's activities. So Low Wave was started off actually as a publishing house for artists' films, experimental film, video art, and documentaries, and became very quickly a curatorial platform that also produced films, also organized many exhibitions, programs for film and academic institutions. So I have just two quick slides here with some Low Wave examples. You can see here on the left side, for example, two films that we produced with Jocelyn Saab and Taisir Batniji. You see also an image of the Cinéma du Réel Festival at the Pompidou Center, with whom we collaborated many times, and this was our 10th anniversary. You have some examples of DVDs that we published, and also on the next slide, you will see a couple of exhibitions. And as you can tell from the images, our exhibitions happened in often rather unusual places, like the Église Saint-Méry, for example, on the left side for a project called Singapore Mon Amour, or the Nuit Blanche and a tunnel in Düsseldorf for a project called Human Frames. So this just to give you an insight in the multiple activities that I have been engaged in my Low Wave days. And it was important, or it is important to note that these Low Wave activities were very tightly linked to the increasingly powerful internet as well as the DVD. Both media really contributed to a hitherto unseen global connectivity and circulation of artists' moving images. So in this euphoric atmosphere of the early internet days, Low Wave provided a dynamic platform for like-minded artists and thinkers and a cachet for the works under its label. And whilst many Low Wave artists were already represented by established galleries, they considered the label as a pertinent and complementary alternative, as they were feeling that once a work was sold, it would rather fall out of the wider circulation and would probably hardly be seen and discussed anymore. So this situation was a significant indicator of institutions' growing challenges in keeping up with the display of the many objects of their collection and in staying a relevant interlocutor for artists. And of course, artists have always been attracted by institutions' prestige, their financial support for new acquisitions, and especially the critical preservation of their works. Yet the cleavage between what artists expected and what institutions were able to offer was probably getting a bit more pressing around the 2000s, as institutions developed in major powerhouses with a very strong branding, and also the development of the art market. So this powerful development of the institutional sector and also the private sector came at the price of a certain decrease in diversity. And I think that was something that I experienced quite consciously, you know, that on the one hand, the internet and this new connected world, you know, provided many new opportunities for structures like Low Wave or for artists who all of a sudden could also promote their work to a now global audience. But at the same time, museums were rather reluctant to actually draw inspiration from these more democratic and network structured. It is true that I think in those years, many museums rather decided to become these institutional powerhouses with an increasingly corporate governance and also some very strong pyramidal and hierarchical organizational structures. And at the same time, they also became these hubs for tourism, so a sort of strategic new cultural tourism. And so I think in these different forces, artists around the 2000s, or the artists I worked with at Low Wave, really asked this question, what their relationship with institutions would be in the future, and how institutions would take care not only of the physical preservation of their collections, but also the intellectual, and actively actually work with these materials. I have a slide here, which I will not go into detail at all, but this is really just a reminder of how artists have always had a very strong interest in collections. And these are examples from the 17th century to the present time, you know, and of course the purpose of these images are very different. Some were more to document, private collections in this process of becoming public collections, or Daumier's, fascinating caricatures of the first temporary exhibitions, the salons in France, and then of course institutional critique, but also more poetic sort of depictions of the museum, for example, in Thomas Strutz's Art Institute of Chicago. So these are just, it's just a reminder for us, how artists have always had a very strong interest in institutions. And I wonder personally why we see so little artists actually depicting what is currently happening in museums, because I think there is so much to talk about. But let me now come back to Singapore. So when I joined the National Gallery in 2017, it was 2 years after the opening of this major institution. And as you can tell from these images, it's a rather spectacular and really beautiful museum. And its opening was really an event, not only in Singapore and Southeast Asia, but also on a global scale. 2 historical buildings. On the left side, you see the former Supreme Court. On the right side, the former City Hall, were brought together to become this museum, the biggest museum actually for modern and contemporary art from Southeast Asia. And the museum has incredible facilities for research, education, beautiful exhibition galleries, historical spaces, a rooftop. It has really everything that a museum of the 21st century should have and can dream of. At the same time, and this was quite surprising to me, the gallery has always defined itself as a people's museum. So a museum really that is for its citizen to develop a sense of history and a sense of belonging through art. I say that I was surprised by this because it is, of course, also a mission for any museum to be especially there for its citizen, but it was a very pronounced direction of the National Gallery from its beginnings. So let's look a little bit back. Actually, the active study of history and heritage was not on Singapore's political or cultural agenda until a few decades ago. After the country's end of colonization and independence in 1965, it really engaged in a very rapid process of modernization. So it is part of the 4 Asian tigers, and this rapid industrialization and exceptional economic growth were really the characteristics of Singapore's development in the second part of the 20th century. So what is specific in Singapore is that it combined very easily Western capitalist principles with distinct socio-cultural Asian values. And this was really a particular process of self-definition after the end of colonization. And artists started also taking a very active role in this process. And I have a few examples here that are notable, especially in the 80s and 90s, where artist collectives formed, for example, the Artist Village under Tang Da Wu, who is until today one of Singapore's most important contemporary artists. Also some fringe sections at the Singapore Festival of Arts in the 1990s, where artists really used this fringe section as a forum to experiment and to voice out their political and social concerns. And then a very important institution that you see on the right side, which is the Substation, which was founded by Koo Pao Koon, an activist and theater play director. So the Substation, for anyone who is interested in Singapore, is really the key space to study, because all artists from different disciplines had a moment at the Substation, especially in the development of their earlier career. So it was then really in the 1980s that this confluence of private initiatives and also state initiatives created a very favorable environment for the Singapore art scene to develop. In 1988, the government set up an advisory council on culture and the arts to review the situation in the country and made plans to transform it into a culturally vibrant society. So you can read this quote here. I think it is quite interesting. So this report that was commissioned by the government in '88 was first written by artists. So it was written from a very artist-centric perspective. And they really claimed, that art should or has a role to play that is artistic, socially sensible, and so on. But before this report was published, the government or some representatives from the government that were part of this commission rewrote the report and included also some economic aspects. So you can see here that good facilities can attract like world-class performances and create opportunities for investors and tourism. So these are actually the two competing forces, and until today, this challenge is very real in Singapore and also experienced across all institutions. So this plan from '89 was then reviewed in 2000, and a new plan, a new blueprint was published, which is called the Renaissance City Plan. And this plan had a slightly different direction. So it really focused on the export of Singapore art and the idea that Singapore could be positioned as a global art city with creative industries that could create revenue, but also become a tool for soft power, especially in the region. It also included the idea that culture was a great tool to strengthen national identity and the sense of belonging. And this vision actually has been more and more reinforced in the next two plans. So after this Renaissance City Plan came the Arts and Cultural Strategic Review in 2010, and it was followed by the current plan, which is called our Singapore Arts Plan from 2018 to 22. So this latest plan really propels the vision more and more inwards and emphasizes the connection of Singapore's communities further and further. So will certain outcomes of Singapore's very strategic planning in terms of cultural institutions has a lot of positive outcomes, like, for example, the setup of such major institutions, as well as an increasing offer of cultural programs, visitorship. It has, of course, also some downsides. And I think one of the biggest and right now very perceptible problems of this very state-controlled planning is that there's really a lack of ground-up initiatives and independent spaces. So spaces that are also, especially for mid-career artists, for artists whose practice would not sit yet well in a national gallery. And I think this has increasingly created a huge gap. So the substation that I just mentioned is one of these spaces that just closed, and also another space called the Center for Contemporary Art, which is part of the university, NTU University, just closed. Not the CCA as an entity. They continue as a research unit and publish and continue with their programs and residency programs as well. But the physical exhibition space has been taken away. And I think related to this loss of independent spaces is an increasing centralization of power under one cluster, which is called the Visual Arts Cluster, which comprises the National Gallery, the Singapore Art Museum, and the Singapore Tyler Print Institute. And this concentration of very powerful organizations, of course, creates also inequalities in the distribution of funds, and also just opportunities for practitioners that, as I just mentioned, are maybe not yet at a level to enter a national gallery, or also for curators, who need to test their practice and who are not full-time collaborators in such an institution. So it is actually quite sad if we think about all the artists who put so much effort in the building of the art scene since the 80s, and the current situation where their voices are more or less excluded from institutional development. So there was an interesting article in the Straits Times in July last year that ended with such a quote, an article that really addressed exactly this problem. And the writer Ong For Sen concluded this article saying, "We need spaces that champion the voice and expression of the artists rather than the state." So one thing that is also quite particular, I think, in Singapore, beyond these master plans and the very careful planning, of also the institutional development, it is that because of these challenges to also make culture a sustainable and maybe profitable creative industry, it comes with a whole set of requirements. So there's a very tight system of key performance indicators, KPIs, that monitors the effectiveness of museums. And these KPIs include, of course, high audience numbers and high productivity criteria for exhibitions. So in this environment, of course, the entry level and more populist programs become key for any institution to justify that they are economically sustainable and also justified as a useful public good. So the problem with these KPIs is, of course, also that they focus very much on quantitative measures, so things, numbers that can be tracked. And it is, of course, much harder to also evaluate, the quality of these programs and the long-term benefits. So we have seen in Singapore recently a huge development of large-scale events that this was still a quote from the National Arts Council that recognizes actually this problem of a lack of spaces. So it's good also that the awareness is there in the ministry. It is only that no solution is found for this problem yet. But so in this configuration where art needs to draw huge audience numbers and so on, you can imagine that many of the large-scale events are playing with rather entry-level subject matters. And we see here a couple of examples. For example, the bicentennial celebration of the colonization of Singapore by the British that was celebrated 2 years ago in 2019. And in the middle, you can see some images of SG50, which was the celebration of Singapore's independence. So any historical event from the colonization to the independence, provides this interesting opportunity for the government, to stage these gatherings and to, as the plan also predicts, create these events that can demonstrate how culture can educate, entertain, and also create these bonds amongst the citizens. You see also on the picture at the bottom on the left, for example, how these events often include some surveys. This is, for example, an opportunity for Singaporeans to vote, which is their driving sort of desire. Is it openness, multiculturalism, self-determination? So it is, these are exhibitions, but they also have these nation-building components. So obviously Singapore cannot become a thought leader with only these service or family-friendly, service-oriented events. So the thought leadership is, of course, expected from institutions like the National Gallery with this outstanding collection and all the facilities to create major and high-profile exhibitions. And that's absolutely what the gallery does. But because of these master plans, it also has to contribute to the more inward-looking goals. So that means that at the gallery as well, there is a huge team that works on these large-scale events and finding a balance between these blockbuster festivals and family-friendly programs and then high-profile exhibitions continues to be a major challenge, not only for the gallery, but also for the larger artistic ecosystem. And I think it's really important for institutions to find this identity, not only in Singapore. And of course, the current pandemic has only accelerated this need to redefine who these institutions are, what they stand for, how they can be dynamic, inclusive, and also responsible cultural players. And the digital has obviously played a major role in this review and how institutions can now reach out to audiences beyond the physical space and how they can use technology to create meaningful bonds between their audiences. So for me, or in my opinion, this is maybe a second chance. It's a huge challenge, of course, but maybe also a chance for institutions, a second chance after the missed opportunities during the internet revolution of the 90s to really look at the digital and internet to maybe draw some inspiration from these flatter networked relationships that they can build with audiences, but also within the organization. So I think this, at least for my experience recently in Singapore, would be really a big step forward in breaking these very conservative internal structures, and to see how different departments can collectively and across their specialization really work on such a joint vision. So Singapore as a smart city has, of course, very easily extended, technology into the art historical context, art institutional context, and technology is mainly employed, for operations, ticketing, wayfinding, visitor count, and so on. But it is also becoming increasingly a tool for pedagogical mediation. And I can show you here an example of two quite recent, actually, additions to Singapore's, the National Gallery's activities and engagement with audiences. On the left side, you see a tour guide, a robot tour guide, Temi, that guides audiences through some of the permanent galleries. It's quite well done. It's a quite conversational encounter with a robot that stops from 5 to 10 works and engages audiences in this new way, and also a chatbot that was developed together with the university on the right side. It's called Athena and is currently used for a Sharjah Chen exhibition, and is a mix of AI and also a guided conversation. So the big question then with this implementation of these new technologies and machines is how to position them. And I think one design philosophy that was seriously discussed within the context of Singapore's art institution is this concept of user centricity. So you probably are very familiar with user centricity as a philosophy because we enjoy it for Airbnb, Grab, Netflix, Spotify, all these services that really place the user at the core of their activity and try to satisfy individual demands and content on demand, and have a very strong sort of focus on the user or consumer. So in the Singapore context, where there's often an overlap between the entertainment industry and the cultural industry, it is interesting to see how this concept was seriously discussed as a way forward in the institution. And I think this has been also problematic to a certain extent because, as we know, institutions have always worked on audience development. Having a good audience base and a loyal audience base is any museum's biggest achievements, and something that a whole group of specialists is working on, from the curators to the conservators to architects, designers, and of course educators. So I think this kind of copy and paste from the commercial sector for the institutional sector has really its limitations. And I think it is important for art institutions now to rather do the opposite, to really emphasize their own speciality in building these audiences and creating that engagement with their visitors, and to not think about technology as the modern future medium and the collection as a medium of the past, but rather to see and explore how meaningful bonds can be created between the physical and the digital. And I think as soon as the digital is really incorporated as part of the curatorial thinking, it offers great opportunities for institutions to become a bit like Low Wave, these open platforms where ideas are more naturally exchanged, where artists become really also part of the development of these institutions, and where we can really move forward as a collective and as a group of cultural people and audiences that celebrate this shared heritage and in all its pluralities. Yeah, so I think I will stop here. In my full article, you can read more details and more historical components, but for today, I think these are some of the ideas that I wanted to share.
Thank you very much, Silke. We have one question from the audience, from Tanya. Are there other cities or institutions that have successfully closed the gap for mid-career artists and non-blockbuster shows that might be applicable in Singapore?
So, I mean, internationally, so outside the Singaporean context, it's a good question. And I think, yes, certainly. I now have to think of maybe a concrete example, but I think in general, my sense is that smaller organizations that are closer in close collaboration with artists are more successful in managing these, in bridging these gaps. And I think even in Singapore, if I can just quickly come back to this context, we have institutions like the Institute for Contemporary Art, for example, that is also part of an art school that has successfully provided this platform for mid-career artists, especially, while providing very professional facilities and great exhibition galleries. So I think, yes, there are examples, but I think because today I focused more on a powerhouse, you know, and I think this challenge is probably the same also for institutions in the West and I mean, other places where really the corporate structure, I think, of the museum is often the problem that needs to be addressed, you know, in order to invite artists more into the strategic planning of the future of these organizations.
Thank you. We have run out of time, but maybe you can briefly answer the next question. Is it possible to get away from KPIs and quantitative measures of a program or exhibition's success, and what better metrics could be used instead?
I hope we can get away from KPIs. I don't think that they are so useful. I mean, I think it is very, very important that we measure success somehow. And I always feel that if we would have more conversations with our audiences, and of course, institutions and also the National Gallery has been practicing this kind of dialogue, you know, with more sophisticated surveys or invitations, you know, where we invite audiences to really discuss with us what they like about programs, what they feel can be improved. So I think it would probably be hard to completely get away from the KPIs, but enhancing, I think, the qualitative measures and especially the actual dialogue with audiences and not just the ticking of boxes and the audience number count, I think is very, very important for the future. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Silke. Thank you. And we will reconvene in 10 minutes for another one of March meeting papers. Thank you.